Hello and welcome back to TVP World. My name is Alex Smolinski and you're watching World Talks. NATO aircraft shot down a foreign drone that entered Latvian airspace on August 14th, while European defense infrastructure is facing a series of fires and explosions. Now, the Latvian incident is being investigated, and Latvian officials have linked the incursion to Russian electronic warfare. Joining us to discuss this in further detail is Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics, Aberystwyth University. Good morning and great to have you here on TVP World.
Thank you for inviting me.
So now, do you think, are we seeing a new phase of Russia's war against Ukraine, one in which the conflict is increasingly spilling directly into NATO territory?
Yes, I think we are. I mean, in some ways, it is a continuation of what we've seen over the past few years, in that we've had, quite a few incidents of sabotage or, other kinds of sort of subtle covert operations going on, which are almost certainly responsible. The responsibility almost certainly lies with Russia. But I think over the summer, we've seen a sort of an acceleration and a more bold dimension to these attacks, where we see more direct attacks. We see more focused attacks on, factories that produce ammunitions for Ukraine, or on, areas which are more directly sort of associated with Ukraine, or where Ukraine can be perhaps implicated. So there's a suggestion that perhaps they're trying to divide Western supporters of Ukraine from Ukraine itself.
Mm-hmm. So given what you just said, and you also mentioned this acceleration that has been taking place over the summer, do you think that Russia could be deliberately testing NATO's response, specifically on the eastern flank, to find out just how quickly and how decisively the alliance reacts to these kinds of incidents, accidents?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the incidents have got a couple of purposes behind them. Firstly, there's the obvious short-term target, destroy ammunition that is intended for Ukraine, for example. But also there is this sense of probing NATO's responses, checking to see how far will NATO respond, what will they do in response, how quickly will they respond, how many times of incursions into NATO airspace will it take for NATO to do something more, perhaps, than simply shoot down a drone or see off an aircraft that goes into NATO airspace. So it is a matter of testing, seeing what the response is, and making a judgment in terms of then what might Russia do next. What would be the response if it accelerated? So if it doesn't think NATO is going to do very much or anything in response to these relatively low-level actions, then it might decide to pick up the pace, do something a little bit more provocative, see what the response is to that. So yeah, it's both a substantive sort of action to try and achieve a certain goal, as well as a process of testing.
And now, given what you just said, what do you think that Vladimir Putin would have to do before NATO concludes that this is no longer gray zone warfare, but an attack on the alliance as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's very hard to judge, because this is really a matter of judgment for NATO to make. So any number of these actions could already have been declared an attack on NATO. And Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all, could have been invoked. And there could have been a more dramatic response. And so what's happening at the moment is NATO is clearly trying to keep things under control. It's trying to play down the level of threat and concern, trying to deal with these things at quite a low level, rather than accelerating and trying to respond in a more dramatic way. So it's hoping that it won't have to respond in a more dramatic way. Obviously, NATO member states, firstly, don't want to inflame the war any further through their own actions. But also, I think there are some real serious concerns about what happens if NATO tries to take more decisive action. Will all members of NATO actually agree and support it? In particular, what would the US do? this, under the second Trump administration, has become a very significant question and a real problem for NATO. So I think for the short term and maybe into the foreseeable future, NATO is trying to sort of keep things calm, try to avoid escalation further.
And now going back to this recent incursion that we just spoke about over Latvian airspace. So now Latvian authorities have said that Russian electronic warfare may have played a role in redirecting the drone. Do we know anything else here in this particular incident? Was that the case?
So I think we don't know for certain whether it was or not. What we do know is that Ukrainian drones have been targeting, ammunition depots and military targets in the part of Russia which borders on Latvia, and so there have been certainly Ukrainian drones active in that area. And the understanding or the belief is that Russia has been able to use its electronic devices to redirect some of those drones across the border into Latvia. And so in this way, it would both prevent some of the Ukrainian drones from striking Russian targets, but also perhaps not only cause damage in Latvia, but maybe give Latvians the impression that the danger is coming not from Russia, but from Ukraine and from Ukrainian drones and Ukraine's attempt to strike military targets in Russia.
Mm-hmm. And now let's go back for a second. You also mentioned these ammunition depots that have been being struck. Do you think that countries are doing enough, to secure these very sensitive areas in order to keep them safe from such attacks happening?
I think NATO is increasingly bolstering its ability to respond. And so there are now sort of NATO response, Baltic response kind of forces which draw upon aircraft from across NATO member states that are specifically there to try and respond to these kinds of incidents. It's almost inevitably more difficult to defend than it is to attack. And so there are many targets which potentially, Russia could try and attack. And so trying to ensure that there are adequate defenses over all of them, I think is a big challenge. What they're trying to do is deploy their resources as effectively as possible. But you're probably never going to get a perfect defense.
And now, just when it comes to defense and trying, like you said, to maybe get a perfect defense, what is your opinion on what Poland and the Baltic countries are doing? Of course, Poland with its East Shield project. What is your take on this? Do you think enough is being done? Should maybe more be done in the near future?
Well, again, it's always a difficult one to decide how much is enough, right? And so ultimately, what will determine how much is enough is whether it's effective or not. But also, each country has to weigh up the cost-benefit analysis of if you put more effort and more resources into this particular area, then there may be less for another one. So I think Poland and the Baltics are doing a great deal to bolster their defenses, and I think part of that is demonstrating to Russia that they're willing to defend themselves, that they're willing to stand up to Russia, that they recognize the threat. And that recognition, that demonstration, that symbolic position, I think, is almost as important as the defense forces themselves.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to ask you a bit more on that. Do you think they're equally important, or is maybe one more important than the other?
Well, they are probably equally important in the sense that you need to be able actually to defend your capacity. But I think the symbolism is also very significant because part of what Russia wants is to persuade the West that there is no real threat from Russia, that these incidents are isolated or they're not connected to Russia, or that's nothing to do with them, basically. And so by demonstrating preparation, I think, and demonstrating awareness, this is a way of pushing back. This is a way of sort of calling Russia out and saying, we understand what you're doing. We are taking steps to counter you. And, implicitly, we are prepared to do more if we need to do more. And I think that is the message that is important to deliver. Especially these days when there's big questions about, how committed the U.S. is going to be to NATO in the future. So for NATO states, particularly those that border Russia, it's even more important for them to demonstrate this sort of willingness to protect themselves, willingness to step up.
And so just to go back to what you said, so how committed do you think at this point, what is your take on it? How committed is the U.S. to NATO? And how do you think we might see that still maybe change before the next presidential elections take place?
So I think we saw signs of this in the first Trump administration, but it was not as pointed as it has been, I think, in the second Trump administration. That this administration doesn't really see the value of multilateral alliances. It doesn't see the value of NATO. It doesn't have sympathy for, NATO members in Europe and their concerns about Russia. We know that Trump seems to be quite, comfortable with Putin. He seems to be very sympathetic towards Russia and towards the things that Putin says and that he does. He's willing to believe Putin, even against the evidence that's provided from U.S. intelligence services on occasion. This is all very worrying. And of course, the fact that, the U.S. has made threats against fellow NATO members in the shape of Denmark over the sort of future of Greenland, and of course has made threats against Canada over, elements of Canadian territory. So, these are all really worrying signs that the U.S. is not terribly committed to defending NATO. And of course, the U.S. has made noises about withdrawing some or maybe all of American forces that are based in Europe. So I think these are all very worrying signs for the future of NATO and under its current configuration. So one of the things that is obviously happening behind the scenes is other NATO member states are talking among themselves. They're trying to build up their own military capacity. They're thinking about cooperation. And against the day when perhaps the U.S. might decide that it's simply going to step back.
And I wanted to ask, because you've also mentioned, of course, the U.S. military presence in other NATO member states. Recently, we had a Polish government official who said that it's possible that there will be a special team created in the states with the goal of establishing a permanent U.S. military presence here in the country. How important do you think that would be, given Poland's location and, of course, NATO's eastern flank, to have such a permanent U.S. military presence here in the country?
I think it's important, again, that the combination of a symbolic presence, a symbolic gesture, and the actual practical consequences of having U.S. troops in Poland, they're both important. And so any sort of stepping up of American commitment to Europe and to Poland particularly would be welcome in both ways, as a gesture and as a step towards building capacity. So I think it's very, very important, especially in light of all of the sort of negative signals that we've been getting from the Trump administration about their views of NATO and the U.S. sort of commitment to it.
All right. And on that note, we'll leave it there. Jenny Mathers, Senior Lecturer in International Politics from Aberystwyth University. Thank you very much for joining us here on TVP World this morning.
Thank you.
And with that, we conclude this edition of The World Talks. But for more news updates and commentary, do make sure to stay tuned to TVP World.